Okay, well, welcome everyone to this roundtable discussion on caste in the South Asian diaspora. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you today from the unceded lands of the Kaurna people, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to congratulate the organisers of this symposium, Nisha and Mridula, for putting together such a wonderful program on such an important topic, and Felix Pal as well organised a really fantastic ECR masterclass. We're finishing the day today with a roundtable discussion on caste in the Australian diaspora, with 4 speakers who will be reflecting on their work on caste and on the submission prepared by 2 of the speakers, Nisha and Vikrant, in consultation with others, on having caste discrimination recognised in the Australian Human Rights Commission's National Anti-Racism Framework. We have a wonderful lineup of speakers for this roundtable. Dr. Mridula Nath Chakraborty teaches Indigenous, Multicultural and Post-Colonial Literary Cultural Studies at Monash University. Mridula's research interests include literary cultural diplomacy between Australia and India, subcontinental writing in Bahasa traditions, and she will be speaking on Dalit literature as a source of resistance today.
Thank you, Priya, and thank you, Nisha, for inviting me to respond to the HRC NARF framework that you compiled with the help of some of the other people present here today. I would like to start by acknowledging and paying my respects to the Woiwurrung and the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation from where I am joining today. Sorry, just give me a second. My presentation is a little bit different from the activist framework that my co-panelists have presented so far. So I'll launch into it right away. So growing up in India in the 70s and 80s in an upwardly mobile family, one remove away from a rural background, I was brought up, quote unquote, unaware of caste. Our surname was an inconvenience, but one that could aspire to and would be rendered inconsequential by a proper education, as post-colonial India promised. In the genteel Bhadralok culture of Bengalis, in which we as Assamese Siletis were interlopers, caste was rendered almost but not quite invisible. As the adage goes, you do not see the camel in the desert, it is ubiquitous among the sands. Ditto with caste, it's everywhere, seeping into every frame of reference and skin and blood and bones, such that it becomes impossible to pinpoint the hydra-headed parameters through which it frames one's life. The epiphany is that the day one awakens with an articulated, conscious, and stated knowledge of this, there can be no point of return from there. This presentation does not claim to narrate a larger history, and Vikrant, I'm sorry, I'm not going to do a history of Dalit literature. Instead, it's a very personal, selective, and idiosyncratic one about my immersion in caste through one particular lens, that is my interest and training in literature. This is different from the legal, political, and sociological lenses through which caste is often studied, even though all 3 disciplines are interpolated in the trajectory of literature. So what follows in this short presentation is a glimpse into what Gayatri Chakravarty Spivak calls an aesthetic education in the age of globalization, where she makes a case for literature as the last available instrument for implementing global justice and democracy. Spivak's central argument is that the neat polarities of tradition and modernity, colonial and post-colonial, are no longer sufficient for interpreting the globalized present. In this scenario, Spivak argues for the social urgency of the humanities and renews the case for literary studies, caged and corralled in the corporate university. Perhaps, she says, the literary can still do something. She asks the following question: are we ready to forfeit the wealth of the world's languages in the name of global communication? Even a good globalization, the failed dream of socialism, requires the uniformity which the diversity of mother tongues must challenge. The Tower of Babel is our refuge. So in my response to the NARF HRC, I choose to highlight the following point in the framework. One of the points in the framework says that argues for is that increase in awareness knowledge about what caste is, what its structural factors are, the harm caste causes, the benefits from eradicating it, and how to tackle caste discrimination at all levels through education and training for governments, civil society, institutions, and community across all Australian state and territories. So my vehicle into entering this political space is the Tower of Babel of literatures produced in regional Indian languages, for the formalized study of which I make a case today. As a scholar of colonial discourse theory and post-colonial studies, I'm all too aware of the interrogation of literature with a capital L as the infamous handmaiden of colonization. Here, however, the standpoint I'm speaking from is informed by small L literatures and huge traditions of storytelling through which the downtrodden, the subaltern, and the indigenous First Nations peoples all over the world have stood in to tell the story of their survival and unceded sovereignty. I speak of my induction into and small engagement with Dalit writing. In this, my Tower of Babel is a journey through literature in the regional Indian languages and Dalit writing and storytelling, channeling the Aziz Chaudhry reference that Nisha made this morning about tenacious, ordinary people engaging in the consistent task of daily resistance to inequities. Our storytellers are among them. So let me start from the start as I recollect it in the medias res of my schooling in India. This is in the 70s and 80s. So the famed NCERT National Council of Educational Research that set the supposedly enlightened syllabus of my school years in India had nary a mention of caste. The only exceptions were through the case of Munshi Premchand's Poos Ki Raat and Budi Kaki, both stories that excited my imagination about peasant lives, like that of my grandparents, and the taboos of untouchability around commensality that Brahminism represented in daily life. Such are the levels of indoctrination, as well as the leaps of imagination possible through pages of realist literature that I could transcend the very different actualities of North Indian Hindi landscape that Premchand set his stories in and the East Bengali sensibilities from where I sprung. It was only much later that I was to understand Toral Jatin Gajrawala's point of view in her book Untouchable Fictions, Literary Realism, and the Crisis of Caste. Gajrawala explains that it is often claimed that if modern Hindi prose literature begins with Premchand, Hindi Dalit literature might be said to begin with the opposition to Premchand for precisely the same reason. Gajrawala, however, refutes this claim by saying that the full flowering of Dalit writing in Hindi begins much later in the 1980s. But it is in the 1920s, during the rise of Swami Achyutanand and the Adi Hindu movement, that argued for a unique and politicized caste identity for untouchable castes, the period during which Premchand fruitfully wrote, and that can be said to have produced the first literary articulations of Dalit identity in the Hindi-speaking belt of North India. And John has added to this in terms of the self-respect movement, in terms of the kind of conscientization around caste that was happening in India in the 1920s. Gajrawala cites the case of the relatively unknown, untouchable poet Hira Dome, whose Achut Ki Shikayat might be considered as the first Dalit writing in Hindi to be printed in the influential Sanskrit journal Saraswati. Translated as the Untouchable's Lament, the work should be understood more as the Untouchable's Complaint in the sense in which Sara Ahmed uses it. The word complaint in Sara Ahmed's treatment is an essential feminist pedagogy that interrogates institutions and their entrenched systemic discriminations and disenfranchisements. In this sense, a complaint, a continual modality of complaint, is a very, very effective way of arguing for social transformation and systemic change. So, critiquing both upper caste and the colonial rulers, Hira Dome's plea for mutual fraternity among caste, drawing on the language of national republicanism, is the genesis of affective and ideological Dalit literary opposition in Hindi. In a critical work following 2 years later, Laura S. Brooke, in writing Resistance, the Rhetorical Imagination of Hindi Dalit Literature, understands this Hindi literary oppositional space as a counter-public that generates Dalit social and political identities. In her analysis of contemporary Hindi Dalit prose narratives, Brooke highlights the aesthetic and stylistic strategies employed by Dalit writers that goes beyond mere celebration of the subaltern voices and uses rhetoric. Again, a complaint can be one form of rhetoric, uses rhetoric as a well-honed tool for challenging hegemonic representations. This is the cover of Laura Brooke's book. But I came to the analysis provided by Gajrawala and Brooke much belatedly, only in the 2010s, a decade marked by something of a renaissance in the scholarship on North Indian Dalit writing. My personal trajectory in this field was quite different. In the 1990s, when I was undertaking my MPhil in Delhi University, there were the first inklings of decolonizing the English literature curriculum in the annals of higher education. Soon after my initiation into colonial discourse theory and post-colonial studies in the academic sphere, I joined a not-for-profit translation publication house that facilitated translations between Indian languages. titled Katha. This publisher instituted the annual Katha Prize stories managed through a vast network called Friends of Katha, who were truly denizens of the Tower of Babel. Ranging from the four corners of the Babelian nation, this network introduced to the Indian public names that were already familiar to the field of contemporary regional Indian language writing in what used to be called the vernacular. And of course, used to be called the vernacular under British colonial rule. It is through my work as an editorial assistant at Katha that I embarked on my education in names like Bama, Shivakami, Urmila Pawar, Namdeo Dhasal, Manoranjan Vyapari, Om Prakash Valmiki, Siddhalingaya, Sharan Kura Limbale, Jupaka Subhadra, Gogu Shamla, Cheran, etc. And around that time, there was a ferment of this kind. There was a ferment of this kind, which was also seen in, for example, the modern Indian novel in translation that was brought out by Macmillan. And these were names that were also coming through. There was a lot of translation of mainstream Savarna writers whose work was being translated from these regional languages into English. But through this also, some other names were coming up. So my combined work in Katha, as well as reading what was coming out in that ferment of the 1990s, which also led to a certain kind of mainstreaming. So a lot of these writings, Dalit writings in translation, are now brought out, now published by mainstream publishing houses. So it was 2 decades later that this training in regional Indian languages and literatures bore some kind of a diasporic fruit for me in Australia. I do not know whether I can frame this as any kind of transnational resistance. Literature works notoriously at glacial speed, and the kind of urgency required to pose a spirited challenge to institutionalized ethno-religious nationalisms may not be possible by ambling down the corridors of storytelling and creative writing, or small as well as capital L literature. But this has been my modest attempt over the past few years. So what I would like to share, with you at this moment is a couple of examples of the kind of work that I've tried to do through my institutional academic positions at 2 different universities in Australia. One of them was a dipping a toe. This was not specifically about Dalit literatures, but it was called Australia India Literatures International Forum. And these modest attempts of mine have been actually very well supported by mainstream Australian institutions. So through the largest of an enlightened Australia Council for the Arts, I applied for and received funding for 3 different large projects that brought this kind of body of writing to Australia. All 3 were undertaken during my tenure at the Writing and Society Research Centre at the Western Sydney University, which also had a specific mandate to address and make meaningful their presence in the Greater Western Sydney area, where migration and multiculturalism were the order of the day. So the kinds of writers that came in that first iteration were writers from different regional literatures, which includes English. So we will just see the case, for example, in the case of Khin Pham Singh Nongkinri and Mamang Dai, who wrote in English, but were bringing these concerns. So these writers, including big, quote unquote, big and lesser known names. So Mahmood Farooqi, Girish Karnad, C.S. Lakshmi, and also known as Abbai, Gogu Shamla from Telangana, Khin Pham Singh Nongkinri, Mamang Dai, Meeta Kapoor, who's a literary agent, N.S. Madhavan, Prabodh Parekh, and R. Shivapriya, who at that time was the Classics and Translations managing editor for Penguin Books, and of course Uday Prakash and Sharan Kumar Limbaleji. So they came to Australia in this kind of a. I don't think it would be an exaggeration to say that this was probably the first time that so many writers from the regional literatures of India, and here I'm including English language regional literatures as well, mostly from the Northeast. So I don't want to make that kind of a distinction. This was a two-day gathering, and of course it included 24 multicultural and indigenous writers from Australia. So this was a kind of literary exchange which also opened the doors for other kinds of exchanges. In the following year, I had the chance, the Australia Council for the Arts invited me to apply for a strategic initiatives to take Noongar poet Ali Kobi Ackerman to Jadavpur University for a tri-national translation workshop where 40 of her poems and one short story were translated into Bengali. Now, these are the kinds of barriers in terms of dissemination that do not offer and do not often enter into the mainstream in a world that is governed by Twitter and social media and Instagram. I did not do any of that amplification work. That was not my concern. What was really important to me was that Ali Kobi Ekreman, as a Noongar poet, she also was later awarded the Wyndham Prize, the famed Wyndham Prize for poetry by Yale University. What was important for me was just that kind of presence of a writer amongst students at Jadavpur University undertaking this translation process. The next area, so this a book was translated, 40 poems and a short story by this indigenous First Nations poet was translated in Bengali. The bigger project then happened again by funding from the Australia Council for the Arts, which was a two-year project. The first day involved taking 10 Indigenous First Nations writers from Australia to two different literary festivals in India. And the second year involved bringing 10 Dalit writers from India to Australia. And by this time I had moved to Monash University. So if you look for it, it was called Literary Commons, Writing Australia, India in the 21st Century with Dalit, Indigenous and Multilingual Tongues. And these writers came to Melbourne for 2 days, and they include the names that have become really well known to at least Indian reading public: Kalyani Thakur Charal, Dr. M. Dasan, Favita Rochelle Dias, who could not get a visa. She's a young writer from Goa. But later on participated in another way. Jupaka Subhadra, Desraj Kali from Punjabi, Devanura Mahadeva again could not receive a visa, but published some of his work on this website. Chandrakanta Mura Singh from Tripura, Ajay Navaria from Hindi, Kinfam Singh Nongkinri on a second visit from Meghalaya, Urmila Pawarji, a doyen of Marathi literature, Venkat Raman Singh Sham, Gond artist and poet, and P. Sivakami. And they were combined with, they were engaged for 2 days with, again, huge names in First Nations writing: Tony Birch, Ali Kabi Ackerman, Lyland Fogarty, Murray Moncada, Jared Thomas, Jane Harrison, Narai Vatari, who performed the welcome and played the didgeridoo with Vinod Prasanna. So all of the Indigenous First Nations writers had gone to India in the previous year in 2015, and all the Dalit writers had come to Australia in 2016. This collaboration resulted in a publication in the Cordite Poetry Review in 2016, and included 25 Indigenous Australian writers, 25 Dalit and Tribal Indian writers, 1 Indigenous Nepali writer, and 51 translations by 40 translators across different areas. And each poem was published in it's an online forum. It's easier to do these things in an online forum. Was published in the language in which it originally came from, and then had a translation. If there's time left later, I would like to draw attention to a couple of poems, but people are welcome to look at the website. So continuing, I just wanted to say a couple of small things, and I'll stop there. So these are some tentative moments of advocacy and activism. Can I call them resistance? I don't know. This is something that I really struggle with. It's not. I don't know what to call it. At this time also, India, a lot of things were happening in India in terms of Dalit literature and how it's quote unquote hit the mainstream. It's a very problematic phrase, and I would love to invite discussion in the session later on about this. Navayana Publications, it became a really big amplifier of Dalit publications. It derived its name from Dr. B.R. Ambedkar's anti-metaphysical interpretation of Buddhism. It's a publishing house that focuses on the issue of caste from an anti-caste perspectives. And founded in 2003, Navayana publishes general and academic non-fiction, graphic books, poetry, and literary translations, and it's best known for its finely curated list of books by and on Ambedkar. Of course, Navayana is also has had its share of had its share of unwelcome criticism. It published this particular edition of Annihilation of Caste called The Doctor and the Saint, which had an introduction by Arundhati Roy called The Doctor and the Saint, and this became a huge moment of discussion and debate and dissent in the Dalit community in India as to why Arundhati Roy had been asked to write the introduction to this edition, and this is something again that we can talk about in the discussion. So in terms of diasporic advocacy, some of the offshoots of those three big events that happened in Sydney and then in Melbourne did open some kinds of offshoots, and I'm not claiming that these were the only reasons. There were a variety of reasons that were creating the ecosystem for diasporic advocacy in terms of literary readings. So for example, the Annihilation of Caste was issued in an Australian print by the University of Western Australia Press under the editorship of Terry and White. And it also, Terry and White also published Uday Prakash's The Walls of Delhi, which were translated by Jason Grunbaum. Uday Prakashji, while not claiming Dalit identity, has written about a variety of ways in which the disenfranchised can be thought about in Hindi literature. Another example made possible again through the Australia Council Publishers Grant is the publishing of the contemporary Hindi Dalit writer Ajay Nawariya's Unclaimed Terrain in 2015 by Giramondo, which was an in-house publisher located in the Writing Society Research Centre at the Western Sydney University. And when Ajay Nawariya visited Melbourne in 2016, we also had the opportunity to have a translation workshop at Monash University, and also with students, Ian Woolford, who is among the audience here, Ian Woolford students from Hindi at La Trobe. So diasporic advocacy is of course happening through, much of it is also happening in the US context, as Nisha mentioned. So as Dalit writers in a globalized world enter the space of global literatures through Writers Festival, this is to be welcome. So for example, Yashika Dutt was invited to the Sydney Writers Festival last year, and I'm hoping that at some point of time, Sujata Gidla's An Untouchable Family in the Making of Modern India, Ants Among Elephants, will also happen. So I'm just going to stop sharing and conclude very, very quickly. So this is a kind of ecosystem. I don't know whether to call it resistance, and it makes me go back to Spivak's exhortations about the Tower of Babel. What role, if any, do these kinds of literary initiatives play in posing transnational resistance to ethno-religious oppressions? What is the role of an aesthetic education? It's a rarefied space. What is the role of an aesthetic education in a contemporary Australian public sphere? In a world that is virally oriented towards the virtual, where does the old and painfully slow technology of print have to offer for conscientization and resistance? This is an extremely labored work, both in terms of time, orientation, pedagogy, reading. You cannot prescribe something which is more than 30 pages for a student in an Australian university, even in literature. So these are concerns that worry me a lot. But at the same time, I'm heartened that First Nation storytelling has made an enormous contribution to the way Australia thinks of indigeneity on unceded land. And this is, of course, my hope for Dalit literature in Australia. Dare we imagine the same for Dalit writing and its rhetorical imagination?